G'day, I'm Mark Hoth and welcome to Swift Almanac. In the first lesson we learned about storyboards, constraints, outlets and actions. Now we're going to start with some coding and we'll need to install our pod file or CocoaPods, create some extensions and build a model, and we're going to look at CoreData. CoreData is a massive topic, so we'll just be doing some basics to give you a feel for what can be done and when you should use it. Watch my soon to be released CoreData series for complete coverage on that topic. So let's install that pod file. So you probably want to follow along with our source code. So just go to Open Xcode, go to Source Control and Clone, enter in the following URL and click on the Clone button. Put a copy on your desktop, press clone, and everything will open up on your desktop that you need to follow and add to if you need it. If you download the Login To project, that will be the final solution if you need a copy of that source code. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is install CocoaPods, and the way to do that is you go to the desktop, make sure you open your terminal and go to the folder where your project is located. Then somehow create a file that's called pod file. You see the pod file's been created. Then what I do is I open up the pod file that I have in the Login To or the final project. There's my pod file. I copy that. I open the pod file in my current project and I paste it in. Now you'll note that we're using platform minimum version of 10. This target needs to be renamed because our target is actually called login. So here I've renamed the projects from when I initially started the project. So I've saved that file and then I go back to the terminal. I'll check that there is something in the pod file. There is, looking good. And then I will run pod install. And that will install this pod called the IQ Keyboard Manager. Tell me the version number and everything is all good. You'll see here there's a message saying you need to use login.workspace for this project from now on. So I can get out of the terminal, and if I go back to my login1 project, it's now created a .xc workspace and a pod file lock, and it has also downloaded the IQ Keyboard Manager, etc. So here in the project file, there is nothing to be seen, no records of pods. Close out of that. And from now on, we use the workspace because the workspace includes all of our code in the login and all of the external frameworks that we're looking to access. In this case, the IQ Keyboard Manager. So in order to use IQ Keyboard Manager, it's quite simple. We just import IQ Keyboard Manager, and then in our app delegate, in the did finish launching with options, we write the following code. So the line IQ Keyboard Manager .shared is enabled equals true. And we have a error message here, and I am not sure why. There you go, it's just because it wasn't built. If we go to our pods file, it's going to ask us to perform all those default changes, which we've done, and we now know have no errors. We can run the library, and there in our simulator. Okay, there's our login screen. So we've got email and we have password, and essentially what this IQ Keyboard Manager does is if you have multiple text fields, then it will ensure that when the keyboard pops up, that the text fields scroll to a place where you can actually still see the text. So it's very useful, otherwise you've got to do a whole heap of calculations, and those calculations are very complex because they're based on the different sizes of the screens that you're dealing with and the relative positions of the text fields. And then it also moves them back and scrolls them around when the keyboard disappears. So we've installed our CocoaPods file, and we've also imported the keyboard manager, and that's working correctly. So the first thing I want to do is change the name of our view controller to login view controller. This is because we're going to have more than one view. We're going to have our login view controller as the first screen, and then we're going to have some sort of menu or home view controller in order to look at the rest of the application. So we can change that. We go to the main storyboard, we click on the one that's called view controller, and then over here for the class, we want to tell the storyboard that it's not view controller anymore, but it's login view controller, and it should pop up here in the pop-up. Sometimes you need to build it before that will work. So the first thing we want to do here is handle this email and password. So these are text fields, and so in our login view controller, we need to deal with these fields, and we use that using the delegate model. So to conform to the protocol, we need to add the UI text field delegate. So if we command and click on the UI text field delegate and we jump to the definition, we'll see what the protocol is, and as you can see, all of these things here are optional, and what we want to know is when we enter a text field and when we exit a text field. So those functions or methods that we want to implement would be the text field did begin editing, and the text field did end editing. And then there are also some notifications, and we want to get a notification when the UI text field text did change. That is, when the contents of the text field has changed, character by character. So we go back to the login Swift, and the first thing that we're going to do, we're not going to worry about this nib, we're going to create a variable which is going to be our active text field, and that's just so we know which of the text fields is currently being edited. And then we're going to add these two functions. The first one is text field did begin editing, and what we're going to do there, it takes as a parameter, or it receives as a parameter, the text field that is actually beginning the editing, and so we set that to be the active text field. And then with this other function, text field did end editing, and we might add something like a save function or a check function there later. Password text. And before we do that, what we need to do is, for our email text, we need to set the delegate equal to itself, and password text dot delegate, that also needs to be set to itself. So the third thing that needs to be done is those notifications, and that's slightly different. To get a notification, we need to set a target procedure, and the formatting of that is this email text, add a target to the self. We want to call the login view controller method text field did change, and we want to find out for events where the edit where the editing has changed is the event. So we need that field for both emails and passwords. We can put them in for both. So that's our function text field did change. It's going to pass the text field, and then we're going to check whether the login button is active or not. And we need to make this visible to Objective-C because of this selector command here. So we've got an error because we haven't created the function yet. Check login button active. So down here, we can get rid of this did receive memory warning. We create another function which is check login button active, and essentially what we want to do is check to see that there's actually values in the email field and the password field. Otherwise, our create or login button shouldn't be doing anything. It should be not enabled or should be disabled. So if email text is empty, or password text is empty, we want to set login button is enabled equals to false, else we want to set the login button is enabled to be true. So we have values in the text field. We've got a couple of errors which we can just fix. They're just little symptomatic things which the compiler will fix by putting braces and the like. If the email is or the password doesn't exist, then this button should be disabled. So we'll just do a quick check of that. Okay, so I've made a silly mistake and forgot to rename this field, and the selector wasn't being called, which is what's causing a problem. So now I will build it again, and what we'll see is, firstly, we'll see that when it opens up, it's still enabled and it shouldn't be, so that's a bug we need to fix. But once there's values in it, it is correctly working like that. So in order to fix it on startup, we need to add a call to check the login button active in our view did load. And when we run that, everything will work fine. So now on startup, it's not enabled, and it'll only be working if we've got a value here. So the next thing we need to do is, this is not an email address, and we need to test that this becomes an email address. And so what we need to do is we need to add another test in here to make sure that the password is actually a password. And the way to do that is we're going to create another method as part of the string. And we're going to call that method is email address, which is going to return a Boolean. And the way we do that is we create an extension for strings. So let's create a new group. Please let me create a new group. That's better. New group, which we're going to call extensions. And in that file, we're going to create a file, which will be a Swift file. We're going to call it string plus valid email, so we can reference it. It's going to save that in the extensions folder we've just created. And we're going to move that down somewhere at the bottom because we're not going to access extensions particularly often. That's better. And so essentially what I did is went onto Stack Overflow. I did a search for valid email functions rather than having to figure it out myself. Don't reinvent the wheel. And we came up with this. Now, when you go to Stack Overflow, you still need to test to make sure that what it does is actually true and what it does. So the writer of the first expression didn't have this 2,0 at the end, which meant that after the dot, you could have just .c, as long as you had a dot basically and another character, which obviously isn't an email address. There's a minimum requirement that at least says like .co or .some country after the, at gmail.co sort of thing. So you've still got to test these just to make sure they actually work. And also there's this statement that came which said try bang or try exclamation mark will always succeed because the pattern is valid. Now, I'm not exactly sure if that's true or not, because I was thinking to myself, what if someone decided in their infinite wisdom or stupidity to use an icono or an emoticon icon as part of their email address? It wouldn't be a valid email address, but it might still stuff up this test. I'm not sure. I didn't test it. I'll leave it for you to try. If you do wish to try something like that, then under Edit, you can get the emojis and symbols down here. That'll pop up and you can use all the various ones to test that out. But anyway, what we've done is we've got an extension of the string data type, and we've just added this one method function called isValidEmail, which returns a Boolean, and it does this little error handling, do catch, returning true if it is an email address and returning false if there's an error. And so when we call our login view controller, we've added this password text.email address. It's going to say something because I haven't built the project yet and it's unaware of the extension. Is valid email. Have I got the right name? No. Is valid email. Build that. And now it quite correctly says create or log in is disabled when we type in test. When we type in something, oh, it's not working correctly because we want it to be not. So we have our not enshrined in or enclosed in some brackets now. So test, looking good, mark at Gmail, looking good, .c, .o, and that's now a valid email and everything is working fine. So we've got our text edit fields working correctly and we're doing our checks at the correct places. Now the next thing we can do is we can move all of this UI text delegate field stuff into an extension. And the reason we do that is because this code is really never going to change and it's just going to make all of this view controller become particularly long. So we'll create a new file, just an all regular Swift file, and we will call it login view controller plus text field. And then what we can do, we need to import the UI kit because we're accessing a text field. We're going to extend the login view controller with the UI text field delegate. And then back in our login view controller, we're going to remove this UI text field delegate because it's being done in the extension. And we're going to take these three functions, we're going to cut them and move them into the extension. We're going to build this. Okay, so it all works. Now the reason we do this is when you get more and more complex view controllers, the handling of the individual sections, especially if you've got things like data pickers or large lists with icons and all the rest of it, or pictures, etc., can become quite difficult to find in one very large view controller file. You want to keep this as small as possible, and so for every group of these delegates you can create a separate extension. You can have multiple extensions, and it makes it really easy if you save them alphabetically, and you can basically see what you're extending, the view controller, and what the extension is. So in this case it's a text field, but if I created another one, it could be login view controller plus UI picker, and that would handle all the picking of files from a camera. Now that we've got the raw data, let's look at writing the functionality for the login button. We know that whenever it's enabled, we're going to have an email address here and we're going to have a password. So let's look at that next. So when we installed CoreData as part of our project in the first tutorial, one thing that happened is the installation process where we checked the CoreData target, added this import CoreData line in our appdelegate.swift, and it also implemented these two sort of helper functions, I suppose, or variables, the variable persistent container, and then this method save context. So a container is how we get information out of CoreData, and a context is basically our data set that we're using. So anyway, we're going to use these two functions, but just be aware that they exist and were implemented as part of the installation of CoreData, as was this file __login.exe data model D. So we've got that. Let's create yet another folder, and we'll call it models because we're following our MVC model or design paradigm. So we create a folder called models. We're going to move our assets and our CoreData into model. We will if it will let us. That's better. And we're also going to create a new file called, just a regular Swift file called user data, and that is going to contain our data structures for our logins. So again, we'll move models down to the bottom because once they're created, we tend not to use them that much. That's better. And of course, we're going to be using CoreData, so we need to import CoreData. Okay, so we need a data structure, and a data structure in this case is quite simple. We're going to create a struct, we're going to call it user, and we need to know the user ID and the password. So we're going to create a variable username, which is a string, and we're going to set that string to be empty, and we're going to create a variable called password, which is also a string, and we're going to set that to be empty. So a data structure on initialization is going to create two strings and they're going to be empty. Note, they're not optional. The reason they're not optional is because we want them to have default values of empty, and they should always work. There shouldn't be a case where we receive just a username and no password, or just a password and no username, and we don't need to handle that case because our code says they always exist, and so we can make that assumption. Then we need a class called, I'm not sure, user data. And that class is going to contain a variable of an array of users. Sorry, an array of user. And we're going to set that equal to an empty array. So what methods do we need? We need an initialization method. We need a method for loading the data. We need a method for saving the data. We need a method for adding or creating a user. We need a method for checking if the user currently exists. And we need, finally, a function for checking a login. And everything's happy there. So on initialization, when this variable user data is called, we want to load the data. So that's all that's going to happen on initialization. So where are we loading the data from? We're loading the data from CoreData. So if we click on this __ login file, you can see here that there are some different keywords and stuff. This is a very brief overview of the most basics of CoreData, just so we can demonstrate the saving and retrieving of data. So an entity, if you are a SQL developer, if you've got some understanding of databases, an entity is basically a table, and we're going to call this entity users. And within the entity, we want to create a couple of attributes. An attribute is like a field, so we want to create I'll get rid of this. We want to create an attribute called username, and that is going to be a string. And in users, we want to create another attribute called password, which is also going to be a string. So if you've got an SQL background, view this as a table, view these as fields within the table. More correctly, this is actually more like a class, and I'll show you how to do that in my CoreData series. But essentially, this is actually can be turned into a class where these are the properties of the class, and then you can have these fetch properties where you can have methods, etc., that act on this class and on these properties, which makes a very nice paradigm for putting data into and retrieving data from CoreData. But at the moment, we're not going to use this as a class. We're just going to use it as sort of the raw basic CoreData where we can get and fetch information. So let's look at these functions. Load data, doesn't need any parameters, and neither does save data. Add user, we're going to need to pass that a username and password. So the username will be a string, and the password will also be a string. And then we're going to simply create a constant. Let temp user equals user, username, password. Now they're both strings. Password will take as is. Username, here we haven't done any case sensitivity controls, so we can make that dot lowercase, I'm pretty sure is the extension. And then we want to add our temporary user or append it to our array of users, which is simply users.append temp user. And this is actually lowercase. So at some point we're going to get our interface to pass the user ID and the password to add user, and that's going to add it into our data structure for our user data, which we can then save later. Okay, so for our check user, what we want to do is we want to find out whether or not the user is already in our database, or in which case we'll try and log them in, or we'll create them as a new user with the password that's been provided. So in check user, we're just going to go username, and it will be a string, and we want to know whether this is true or not because we want to act on it. So it's going to have a return value. Now the return is going to be are they there or not. It's going to be true or false, but I'm going to use an enumerator just so you can show you how enumeration can work. So at the top of the page, I'm going to put enum login results, and then I'm going to create these 4 enumerations: case when the user does not exist, and the case when the user exists. And I'm also going to use this login results for the login, so we're going to have login succeeds or password fails. So essentially what I can do here is I can return one of these enumerators as the return value. In check use, what we're going to do is if users, which is our array of each individual user, contains where each array item of .username equals username.lowercase, that's the username that we've passed. If it exists, then we want to return .userExists from our enumeration. Otherwise, we want to return the user does not exist. So let's go back to our login view controller and see what that code should look like. What we're doing is this button can only be clicked on when it's enabled, and we know that when it's enabled we've got an email address and we've got a password. So down here at our login button, we want to use the commands we've got to either add or check or log in. So what I do is I just create these 2 constants, email text.text and password.text. My user data is dying, so I will need to go up to the top of the login view controller and add a variable. So there I've created what's essentially global variable user data, and it's pointing to this class. So these should all disappear eventually. It's got no member save users, so we'll go back to, so we'll go load users, save users, that might make things easier. .login, we need to get a username and password, so we'll update that as well. And that would also be returning login results. So running through what happens with the login button, the first thing we're going to do with our username is check to see if the user exists or not. So if the user does not exist, then we want to add them to our database. So we call add user and pass the username and password. Once we've added the user, we're then going to save that user to the database. Now I've got some notes here, what we're going to do in lesson 3, which is if we've checked and added them, there's no need to verify them because they've added in a new username and password, and so we can skip straight to the home window, and we need to potentially save those to user defaults if they've checked this auto login button. So if the user does not exist, then that means the user exists, and so if the user exists, we want to check the login by testing the username and password. Now if the username and password matches the ones we have in our CoreData database, then we'll get a return value of login succeeds, and again we'll move to user defaults and the main view, and if the login fails, then we'll get this printed message login failed, and we'll need to show an alert. So that's all the code needed for the login button. Let's finish off our user data and write stuff to CoreData. So when we check the function firstly for login. We just want to check to see if a username and password already exists in our users array. And that's quite similar to what we did here in check user. We go if our user, the first user where the username is equal to the username that's passed. Now there really should be only one, but we'll go into that in load and save. But we basically want to find the first username to see if it's in the database, and if it is, then it'll be that user record or user structure from here will be placed into this temporary variable or constant variable, and then we can check the password against the password that's passed. If the password is also successful, then we can say that's succeeded, and we return that as our login result. And if it hasn't succeeded, then we're going to be failing, and so we will return password fails. Now, if this user does not exist, then we should actually never get here. So that's why we're returning password fails. If the user is not in the array, then check user would have found them, and we would have added them and gone through a different pathway. So if you're wondering why this doesn't just say login failed, it's because it can only occur when the password has failed itself. Whether or not you display that as an error message is up to you. So that's basically handling everything. Now we can deal with CoreData. So currently we have nothing in our CoreData database. So the first thing we're going to want to do is save users as they come through. And to do that, this is the generic way of saving data to CoreData. Now the first thing is we've got an error because we're using app delegate. In our app delegate, we've got this lazy variable persistent container, and we've got this save context method, and we want to get access to those. So at the top, instead of importing foundation, we want to import UI kit, which will give us access to the UI application. Right, so we've got our app delegate, and then as you can see, app delegate has that persistent container, and then one of the properties of persistent container is the view context, which is basically a view of this. And so what we do is we form another constant context because it's a lot shorter than writing appdelegate.persistentcontainer.viewContext all the time. Okay, so what we're going to do is we want to save our list of users into the entity. So we have a look. The entity is called users, and there's a username and password that we need to send through. So within the context, we create a new user, which is an entity description. We want to insert a new object into the entity users, and we're using that context, which is linked back through app delegate and through all the CoreData magic. So going through our array of users, for each user we take new user. We want to set the value of user.username, which is going to be this email address, and for the key username, which is taken from the entity description, again, they must match. We're going to place this value for this key. And we're going to do the same we're going to put this string into this key password. Then what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and save that context. If it's successful, we're going to type user saved. If it's not, we're going to print an error. We can do other things, but at the end of the day, at the moment, there's not much more we can do. It's going to iterate through all the users in our database, and it's going to save them. Well, it's going to print out at the end that the users have been saved. If I create mark@gmail.com, type test, this should create a user, which should save it. So as it says, it's saving the users. The user was saved, and then all the users have saved. So that's working well. And now we have saved one user to our CoreData database. So we need to load the users. And as you can see, when user data is initialized, the first thing we're going to do is load all of the users into the database. Obviously, this is going to be a very small database, so we don't need to worry about performance issues. If this was a very large database, you probably wouldn't load every single user into memory. But again, it's just a demonstration of using CoreData. Okay, so with loading users, it's pretty similar to saving users. We've got a print statement saying that we're going to load the users so we can track what's going on. When we're loading, just in case, I've set the users array to be empty. It might not be necessary, but it might be in the future, so just for safety I've put that in. Then we do our magic where we get the app delegate variables, and we get the context, the view context of our container, and then we create a request, and that's known as an NF fetch request, and it's a generic of this NS fetch request result. Try saying that. And we want to get the entity name of users. So what we're saying is go into our CoreData, find an entity called users, and give us everything. And we don't know how long it is or what it is. We don't know what's there. Could be pictures, could be ints, could be strings, could be anything. So it's using a generic, but just give us everything. And the request returns objects as false. It's false. I'll go into that in our CoreData in our CoreData tutorials, but basically it means only give us complete records. And then we try do this, let the results equal try context.fetch request. If we have a record, if the results count is greater than 0, then for each result in results, we're going to get this NS managed object. And what we want to do is we want to get those values. So we get if let username equals result.value for the key username, we want to look at it as a string. And we also want to let password equals result.value for key password as a string. So you might not have seen this before, but this is actually two statements. It's saying if this, get the username, then do this, get the password. And then if both of those conditions occur, what we want to do is we've read them from our iPhone into memory. We've got these two variables, username and password, and we want to add them to our internal database. So we're going to add a user, and that's going to call our add user function, blah, 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 and we're going to add it to our users array. If there, for some reason, is not a username or not a password, again, it shouldn't occur because we're mandating it through our user interface, then we're going to get an error. If there's some problem with CoreData, we're going to get this catch statement and we're going to get an error. And then just for some tidying or some display within the debugger, I've got this for each user, print out the username and password, and printing loading complete. So if we run all of this, we've already saved one username into the database. When we've clicked on the button, that's required us to get a list of users. And so it's done loading the users, and the user that we do have is mark@gmail.com, and the password was test. Loading was complete. Then I created this user mark@gmail.au and test. I've also put a capital letter in there. It saved the users. It's gone user saved, user saved. That's because there was the one in memory, and then there's the one that we just created. And now if we click this button again, then mark@gmail.au will be there and test will be there. And so that should give us login succeeded. And if we put a wrong password, that should give us login failed. So we know the password checking is working. And if we run this again, we should find that there are 2 users in our database. And here you can see we've got mark@gmail.com and we've got mark@gmail.au. You can also see that the lowercase worked, and it's successfully done that. We put gmail.au in there. That should fail on the login. Yes. So the lowercase testing is also working as well. So that's reading and writing to CoreData and to entities. Everything is now working in our app, our login app, except for this auto login. And once we have logged in, we want to move to another window, and we'll show you that in the next lesson. Well, this is all pretty good. We can now set up a login screen, code some behaviors, and save the information to our iPhone. In the next lesson, we'll be implementing the auto login function, which we'll do with user defaults, yet another way to save data persistently on our iPhone. And then we will look at creating alerts for errors and segueing into other windows once we've actually logged in, getting into the guts of our application. If you have any questions about the tutorial, then please leave a comment below or hit me up on Twitter @SwiftAlmanac. Please subscribe to the channel, it's free, and check out our website at www.swiftalmanac.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.